Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Community Center Investment Program Monitoring webinar. My name is Rebecca Bover. I'm the Director of Community Development with the CDFA. And I just want to thank you all for joining us today for this very important webinar. We anticipate the time for the presentation to run till about 11:30 with plenty of time for questions. And we are recording today's webinar, and we will share it along with the presentation slides by early next week to all of you. If you have questions, I want to ask that you please post questions in the Q&A box. Preferably do not use the chat. We'll be monitoring the Q&A box, and we want to make sure that as you put your questions in, if you could just check to see if there's anything related to the question that you're already asking, just to try to prevent duplicate questions. But certainly we'll be happy to follow up. If you have any project-specific questions, we won't ask them during the webinar. We'll ask that you hold those and you follow up with a member of our team after the webinar. So if you haven't already, why don't you take a moment to just introduce yourself in the chat, including your name and organization that you're representing today. So I'm going to run through, we can advance the slide to the agenda for today's webinar. So today we have a lot to discuss with you. There's a lot involved with the new monitoring that we're implementing for this program. So we're going to go over the reporting structure for this funding. We'll discuss Gopher requirements, the risk assessment process, the awardee and subrecipient monitoring requirements, any changes to our grant management system or GMS, those all the various components of that, the monitoring checklist and project impact. And we'll also be highlighting project closeout and how all of this will impact the claims process. We'll have available resources for you, and then we'll go through key dates and deliverables. So now we're going to get right into all of this. I'm going to introduce our Senior Community Development Manager, Chris Monroe, and he will take you through the process.
It would be helpful if I unmuted. 4 years into this, still doing that. Appreciate everyone being here with us on Valentine's Day for this very interesting topic regarding your Community Center Investment Program award and your project and the reporting structure, monitoring, closeout, and other items related to the agenda. So on the first slide here, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the reporting structure and kind of the flow of funds. So the Federal Treasury provided these funds to the Governor's Office for Emergency Relief and Recovery. And as these are federal funds, they're subject to, as you know, 2 CFR 200. So basically the Treasury coordinates with Gopher and discusses the deliverables, the sort of reporting structure that's needed, and Gopher in the end reports to the Department of Treasury. And then we at the Community Development Finance Authority, we were subgranted those federal funds from the Governor's Office. So we report to Gopher. We coordinate with the awardees and subrecipients. We use those terms relatively interchangeably. And we provide program administration and guidance. And that's sort of why we're here today, is we've received over the past few months information from the Governor's Office related to how they would like to see reporting done on these projects, how they would like to see monitoring done on these projects, how they'd like to see compliance done on these projects. So we have been working to put together documentation information, also coordinating with our grant management system to sort of make this process hopefully as easy as possible and utilize existing information within your applications and files to sort of provide details to the Governor's Office, which in turn they'll provide that information to the Treasury. And then the awardees and subrecipients, which are you all, are responsible for the project implementation. So that would be your project team or your project coordinator, working with funding partners, working with municipalities, your municipality working with the different programming partners you might be working with, any administrators you're working with, and reporting to us, the CDFA, so we can in turn coordinate that data, provide it to Gopher, then they provide that to the Treasury. And your responsibility, as is our responsibility and Gopher's responsibility, is to comply with state and federal requirements. So that's sort of the breakdown of the funding and reporting structure. And if we could go to the next slide, please. So the following are the governor's office or Gopher's project requirements, and these are requirements that are laid out under 2 CFR 200. Some of them will be our responsibility at CDFA. Some of them will be your responsibility as the municipalities or nonprofits. The first requirement that we have to or process we have to go through is a risk assessment. And this is something that is the CDFA's responsibility. This includes review of documents previously provided to CDFA. So the UEID, you remember those, budgets, financials, implementation schedule, and others that were provided over the course of the application or in follow-up meetings or through status reports or through claims, that kind of stuff. So we're taking an inventory of the documentation that's already been provided. We also use this process to identify missing or incomplete documents. So we're sort of doing another review to establish if there's any outstanding components that might have been missed that we need to have on file in order to essentially lower the risk rating of the project and identify any potential impacts to project implementation and or compliance. So as I mentioned, if we're missing a key piece of documentation that could impact project implementation or compliance, that might be flagged sort of as a higher risk flag. So we would work with you to provide that information through what will be the monitoring process following this up. And Gopher has provided a template for these risk assessments, so they're standardized across nonprofits and municipalities. So we'll go through that process and talk about timeline a little bit later on. And here we talk a little bit about why a risk assessment is needed. It enables us to tailor guidance, resources, technical assistance to best support projects. Confirm taxpayer funds are leveraged by projects engaged in risk mitigation. So inherently, there are some things in projects that are outside of any of our control, whether it's the labor market or availability of supplies or turnover in staff, all sorts of stuff. So inherently, there's always going to be some risk in projects, but our goal is to work with you, to work with Gopher to mitigate risk whenever we can and provide early risk assessment and risk reduction to promote project implementation and closeout. So ideally, the risk assessments would have been formalized and kind of completed earlier on in the process, but because we had such a rigorous application process, we do have a rigorous claims checklist that we provide. We do have status reports. So we have sort of implemented these peripherally across our program, sort of how we've structured it. And then this is a little bit more formal of a process established by Gopher. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So here we outline the general components of the risk assessments. The first is the project budget compared to organizational budget to demonstrate a metric for financial capacity. As you all know, you went through an underwriting process as part of the application. So we will revisit that or any sort of updated information that's been provided or that we might need and kind of review that against the Gopher standards to establish a risk rating there. Eligibility. So we are seeking to confirm alignment with eligible activities. For this, it's building or renovating a community center or what was identified as a community center to ensure that the programming aligns with the eligible components. So basically to make sure that you're not opening up a bowling alley. It's just, we're reviewing what you've already provided and making sure that everything is in alignment. Period performance, which is reviewing the implementation schedule, determine accuracy and completeness of information and status reports. So the first round of status reports were recently due. So we'll be checking those. We'll be checking the original implementation schedules provided in the application to make sure that they all align with the deadlines under this grant and loan program. And then general indicators, which include your project team or staff, previous lawsuits. This is some of the stuff that's identified in the checklist. So a lot of that, like the lawsuits, might not apply, but if there's anything flagged or if we do have any questions, we might be reaching out with that. And experience with previous grants or federal loans. So some of you talked about that in your applications, whether you've received as a nonprofit grants or federal loans in the past. And the purpose of that is to basically say, if you're familiar with working with these programs, you're at a lower risk. If you haven't, you might be at a higher risk. And that's not a bad thing. That just means that we might need to provide more technical assistance and better resources to the projects to make everything a little bit easier. So that's kind of what we're looking at. Here is a screenshot of the subrecipient risk assessment tool provided to us by the governor's office. And again, this is something that CDFA will be completing. You do not have to complete this. We might be asking for a little bit more information potentially, but what our process is to go through this risk assessment checklist, and then this will help inform the level of monitoring that your project will be subject to. So a lower risk project will be subject to a kind of brief monitoring process, and a medium to high risk project might require a little bit more intense or frequent monitoring, just to ensure that we are getting the documentation that Gopher needs and that the Treasury needs, and we're aligning ourselves with their standards. So here you can see that there's some general questions. Is the UEI provided both accurate and consistent? You all provided accurate and consistent, to our knowledge, UEIDs at the beginning of the application. That was part of the threshold review. There's your SAM.gov registration, Secretary of State database, and here we also have some subjective questions, like how would you assess the level of complexity for the entity? Some entities are inherently a little bit smaller, a little bit more straightforward. If there are larger entities that have subsidiaries or other components that you might increase the complexity, that's just something that we'd be taking a look at as well. We could go to the next slide, please. So before we start on the awardee and subrecipient monitoring, I just want to take a brief second to see if there were any questions related to the risk assessments, or if there's anything in there.
We don't have any questions yet related to that. We just had a question about if projects will have an opportunity to update their implementation schedule.
Yes, absolutely. So that can either be done in the status reports, or that can be filed as a correspondence if it's not during the status report timeline. So if you are experiencing any delays, or if you're ahead of schedule or just on task, if you'd like to add components, preferably with the implementation schedules, they're as detailed as possible, as reasonably possible. So you don't have to put in, on March 30th, we're going to be putting up studs, and then the following day we're going to be putting up, doing electrical, and then eventually drywall. We don't need that granular level, but it would be helpful to know if there's, if you're going through the permitting process, if that's underway, if you are breaking ground when you're anticipating on doing that, major components as far as like identifying when you're hoping to get your certificate of occupancy, or if there are, other components that you'd like to indicate. So typically in implementation schedules, it could be anywhere between maybe 5 to 10 pieces. And then if upon our review, if we're noticing, a gap or something that might be missing, that might be critical, we just might ask that you add that into your implementation schedule, if that makes sense. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later.
Great. That's the only question for now.
Great. So moving on to additional governor's office project requirements, the awardee and subrecipient monitoring. This piece is conducted by you, the nonprofits and municipalities. We'll provide a monitoring checklist and resources. The checklist is structured to adhere to the governor's office standards under 2 CFR 200. And it utilizes a simple drop-down method with opportunity to add notes. And we've included a screenshot of the monitoring checklist and a few slides that we can review. But they really have, the governor's office provided us with toolkits and checklists and a lot of other things that we're tailoring our guidance to in hopes of making it as streamlined of a process as possible. And of course, we're always happy to answer any additional questions or work with you offline to sort of go through that process. The checklist is based on existing documentation provided in your application or documentation that should be on file already for established municipalities and nonprofits. And the examples we have below are included but not limited to a conflict of interest policy, a code of ethics, your financial management standards, and expenditure records. And we have templates for these items too. So if you don't have these on file currently, that's not a deal breaker. We can certainly work with you to get those documents either on file or up to date to the federal standards and make sure that you're in compliance with those standards. And that's sort of the point of the monitoring project, is to it's not punitive. It's not like we're going to be nothing bad will really happen. It's just we're supposed to be ensuring that these files are up to date to ensure compliance with 2 CFR 200 and ensure that taxpayer dollars are being invested in projects that are to those standards. So you can go to the next slide, please. So here we have the awardee and subrecipient monitoring continued. CDFA will provide the corresponding checklist after confirming and finalizing the risk assessment results. There are 2 types of checklist, low risk and high risk. And as I mentioned, CDFA will go through the risk assessment process for each organization and municipality. We'll determine if the level of risk we have identified is low or high, and then we'll coordinate with you and send the corresponding checklist. And again, low risk would include organizations that might have a substantial amount of these documents already on file. They might have already worked with federal grants or loans and are familiar with the process, so it would be relatively short. And then the medium to high risk would be those projects that maybe this is their first time, with federal or grants or loans, might require a little extra technical assistance, which we're happy to provide to sort of get you up to that level. And why is the project monitoring necessary? So it's necessary because it provides structure to mitigating risk and documenting compliance. It protects taxpayer funds by ensuring projects are aligned with 2 CFR 200 and federal standards, and promotes consistent and accurate reporting, and confirms the timeline for implementation and provides smoother project closeouts. So in theory, the monitoring process kind of starts at the beginning of the project, make sure everything is in place and ready to move forward. As you go through implementation, there are structures in place to allow for easy reporting, structured reporting. So we're not, it's not as ambiguous, or we're making sure we're asking for exactly what we need. And then when we get to close out the project, so once you have your certificate of occupancy, once, the last nail is in the roof or whatever it takes to get to that point, we can look back at the project and see that everything has been compliant up to that date, or if things were missed at the beginning, or if there was a missed report, we can go back through and just square that up pretty easily. So here we'll talk a little bit about the grant management system components. Priscilla, would you mind going one more slide forward? I just want to make sure we didn't miss okay, cool. Can you go back, please? Thank you. Just want to make sure we have the checklist in there. So the grant management system components, we're going to be updating the grant management system, which is sort of the hub for all the documents that you've already uploaded. A lot of you've sent correspondence or have provided status reports. Some of you have submitted claims. Of course, the application was through our grant management system. So that's sort of the portal, how we're going to be storing the documents as a result of the monitoring process. So the documentation component in the grant management system that we're updating is structured to match the 2 CFR 200 requirements. The components are labeled for easier navigation. As you have seen so far, when you go to submit a document in the document center, you have to name the document, and it's sort of blank there. We're developing a checklist, or not checklist, but it's basically a template in GMS that has each document that's required labeled, so you know exactly what it is we're asking for. And I believe we'll have a screenshot of that later on too, we can talk about. Templates will be provided, as I mentioned, for like the conflict of interest, or procurement policy, or financial management policy, or organizational chart, that kind of stuff. We can certainly provide templates for all those things. And technical assistance meetings are always an option for further support. So if you're having trouble navigating the grant management system, if you're having trouble locating documents or need templates, you can always email us or schedule a meeting through our website, and we'd be happy to talk further. The next component is the financial management component, and this aligns with the claims that you either have submitted or will be eventually submitting. And the columns are structured to make entering information easier. So we'll provide a screenshot of that later and kind of go over what that looks like. Some of these we are in the process of continuing to update. So for instance, the financial management section in the grant management system will look a little bit different than the one that's provided in the slideshow, but we're just adding a few additional columns. And again, everything's labeled, so for ease of use and for accessibility. The other component is procurement, which is for primarily grants. The components include the minority-owned and women-owned business participation, open bidding, invitation to bid, etc. So all of the procurement components under 2 CFR 200 will be included in there that are applicable to the projects, and those components will have to be updated. So you'll just upload the corresponding documents to the label, and hopefully that should make things easy. So this is a screenshot of the monitoring checklist, and this is the document that you will all receive. And as I mentioned, it has a pretty simple drop-down option. So, does everything in the subrecipient documentation suggest that funding is being used consistent with U.S. Constitution, federal law, all those things. And, I think most, if not all, projects can answer yes to these questions, especially at the beginning of the monitoring checklist. So in order to answer that question, you would just click into that box where it says yes. There's a yes or no option. You would select yes if it's yes, or no if it's not. And then you would move through the checklist here. I did put one no in here for an example of what would happen if you answered no in the checklist. So the police won't come for you. The FBI won't come for you. You just click no, it'll pop up red, and it will indicate the next steps. So it automatically populates to the right of that no column. It says work with subrecipient to obtain names and compensation of employees, flag this issue in the monitoring results letter. The information should be provided as part of the subaward agreement. And I don't believe we requested the Form 990s for your nonprofit organizations at the beginning of the application stage. We might have seen some documentation as part of the financial review, but this is a pretty simple fix because you have to provide a Form 990 anyway. So that just might be the document that you upload in order to satisfy that requirement. And then once that's completed through the monitoring process, you would provide that form, and then on follow-ups, we would just, update the checklist to say yes, and then that would satisfy that requirement for the remainder of the project. So we can go to the next slide. Thank you. Any questions? Just want to take a pause because we just moved through the monitoring, and that is something that the subrecipients will be responsible for. So I just want to make sure we're answering any questions related to that.
We have no questions, so I think you're doing a good job in your explanation. Okay. Hopefully that's what that means. Keep going.
Here's open, or people are out skiing, and that's totally fine too. Don't blame them. We haven't gotten much snow this year anyway. But yeah, if you do have any questions, or especially any feedback, so maybe you're noticing something that doesn't make sense, or you would like to see something a little bit differently, please provide feedback in through this presentation, through the channels in this presentation, or after the fact. We'd be happy to follow up with you. So this is a few of the additions to the GMS landing page. We also did include an environmental review documentation component, which I think I had forgotten to mention in the earlier slides. The environmental review documentation is again just to the 2 CFR 200 standards. It's not, for those of you familiar with our CDBG program, it's not a full environmental review, or it doesn't have to be a full environmental review. We provide a sort of really pared down checklist with a few simple questions that you can answer. And then there's spaces for documentation you can provide related to those questions, and we'll go through that in a little bit. So I've highlighted the on the GMS landing page. When you go into it, this might look a little bit different because it's from our view and not your view, but you'll still see you should see most of this stuff in there: the documentation, environmental review documentation, procurement for grants, and financial management. Just those things on the right indicate the level of security. So I'm not sure, again, as awardees or subrecipients, what you can see, but this is just our view. But on the left, the highlighted pieces will be up to date in your grant management system landing page. So we could go to the next slide, please. So this is the grant management system documentation component. So you can see it looks a little bit different than the one you are used to using. We've included the breakdown and sort of have named those documents that are required as part of the risk assessment and monitoring process. So here you can see conflict of interest, internal controls, organizational chart, record retention policy. A lot of these you will already have in place or can quickly get up to date if needed. The ADA acknowledgement and design confirmation. So we know as part of your application, you might have been in the early design phases when it comes to the ADA accessibility components. So we would just, part of this is just asking for the formal design confirmation, or to ensure that you are still utilizing those design specs related to your project, because that's a pretty important piece of this project. And again, federal funds are subject to the Americans with Disabilities Act, so we want to make sure that we're up to date on that. So again, we've named these components. You're able to just go and upload. We ask that the file name match as close as possible to the named attachment, so that way we can make sure that it's all lined up properly. And again, if you need any sort of templates or assistance with this process, we are happy to help. So we can move to the next slide, please. This is the environmental component. Under 2 CFR 200, projects are subject to this requirement. If you are, we haven't seen too many claims come in, so we're assuming that either your construction is not yet underway, or if it is, it's still in an early stage. So we would just ask that this environmental component be completed quickly. There's an environmental review certification, which shows that there, as again mentioned, there's a few simple questions related to kind of the scope of your project, location of your project, or if there are any sort of glaring environmental impacts. And then below, if there are not, you can move forward. If there are, we have sort of the response named attachments underneath. So for instance, if there's asbestos containing materials, you would include information in there. National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit, if applicable. So if you're going to be, maybe attaching a trash incinerator to your project for renewable energy, maybe you might have to put something in there related to that. But I don't remember seeing any of that in the original project design. So again, this sort of lines up with the process that you've already gone through. And we just ask that you update this component in GMS. If you do have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to us, and we can certainly help. This is the procurement for grants. So this is specific to the grant awardees. The front end provisions are approval of the bid specs, the bid distribution list, the minority and women-owned business participation. And there may be some other documents that we'll name attachments for and put in there after we conduct further review and sort of work through the process. So we'll be sure to update you all and update GMS as needed. So if you're in the process, if you are a grant and you're in the process of bidding out your your project. Just make sure you're working with us to, and review those bid specs, make sure that the federal minimum requirements are in there. Davis Bacon doesn't apply. The Buy American, Build American, I believe it's iron and steel apply. So again, well, we'd have to double check that. I believe we had guidance that it was waived, so I think you should be fine with that. But again, that's the point of the monitoring process, is just to make sure that we at CDFA are aligned with the federal requirements, and then we are supporting you as the awardees to also align yourselves with the federal requirements as well. I see that the Q&A box has maybe another question in there. Do we have anything specific to?
It was just, we've already had a question about whether or not templates will be provided, which you've already mentioned, that we will absolutely provide templates for all those required documents. There's a question about, which I think we've already answered, but if they have submitted many of these documents already through the application process, do they need to resubmit again? And if they do, but I don't know if you wanted to just reiterate.
Yeah, we can talk about that briefly. For the purpose of just being consistent with the monitoring and ensuring that the GMS documentation component is filled out in alignment with the documentation provided by the governor's office, by those checklists and stuff. We've just asked that those documents be uploaded into the named sections in the grant management system documentation component. If that is prohibitive, or if you're having trouble with that, we can certainly touch base with you, but it just would make for the overall reporting process easier. We'll reduce the amount of follow-up questions. So for instance, if we do a monitoring later on in the project, we're not going back and saying, hey, we're having trouble finding this document, or or anything like that. We could just scroll through the documentation component, see that you're up to date, and that should hopefully reduce any issues further down the line.
Okay. Another question, will the architect's certification of having met ADA and environmental standards in design and construction be sufficient documentation?
Potentially. So we would just have to take a look at anything that's different than what the templates or standards that we're providing. It doesn't necessarily mean that information is not applicable or not viable, but we just need to take a look at what that certification might entail to ensure that it's covering those the components at least listed, for instance, under that environmental checklist, and make sure that all aligns. And if it does, then that should satisfy that requirement. So again, we're providing this, not at the very get-go. We have been getting information from Gopher and tailoring our guidance to that. So we understand that there might be some documentation that you've already obtained that might look a little bit different than what we're requesting. And, we're happy to take a look at that and see if that aligns with what we're requesting.
And that's it for now.
Great, thanks. So the next component here is the grant management system financial management component. As I mentioned, there will be some additional columns added related to an audit and other things that you can fill out. So this is just a matter of going back through the claims process, seeing the claim number you've submitted, seeing if it was transferred through the electronic fund transfer, confirming dates of when the money was received, to make sure that, for instance, it's not sitting out there for a while. Any deposit slips, that kind of stuff. So again, we have this labeled pretty well. If you do have any questions, you can let us know. This just has to be filled out as you're going through the claims process. So the next stage after we go through the risk assessment process, we go through some monitorings. Higher risk projects are subject to more frequent. Sorry, can you go back, please? Thank you. Are subject to the higher risk projects are subject to slightly more frequent monitoring. So, and that's just a matter of us working with you to get the documentations up to date. Once you provide those documents, you'll obviously the risk rating will be lowered, and we'll have less frequent check-ins related to that. So the monitoring closeouts are conducted by us, CDFA. We review the monitoring results over the course of the project. We review the implementation results. So whether that's through site visits or status reports or a combination of the two, or any updates you might provide, just to make sure that that is complete under the timeline that it needs to be completed under. Review of reporting consistency and content. So going back through status reports or correspondence, making sure that the information provided is accurate and complete. And then determination of closeout status and project results. So in hope, we hope that through the risk assessment, through the monitoring process, and then the monitoring closeout, that all projects can be closed out. That's kind of the goal, on time and accurately. And the purpose of the monitoring closeouts better prepare projects for potential auditing. So if the Treasury or Gopher need to come in and pull project files, if we go through the risk assessment and monitoring process and implementation process correctly, then all the documentation that's needed, or at least a substantial amount of it, will be in our grant management system. We can provide that information, and it will be a less intrusive and more streamlined process as far as potential audits. Highlight key project components. So again, if there's pieces of the project that you're excited about, or if you have sort of some good deliverables out of the project, or your programming is up and running quickly at the end of your project, just documenting that, and that's just great for people to know about, and support accurate and timely reporting. So here we're talking a little bit about the project impact related to the risk assessment, monitoring process, and closeout process. As we mentioned, the grant management system documentation component, it will match the governor's office required documents. Required documents will be uploaded by the project representative and aligns with the monitoring checklist. So, who is uploading the documentation? It could be the authorized official. It could be, your grant administrator. It could be the project lead. It would just have to be someone who's very familiar with the project, who has the grant management system access, that was involved in the process. So it should line up with people who already have access related to your project. And the grant management system financial management component will also match the governor's office required standards, will align with the claims components, and it's the primary mechanism for documenting financial management compliance. So the grant management system procurement component, it applies to grants. The component will be used to document minority and women-owned business participation. Component will be used to document competitive bidding process and other things like that will line up with Gopher requirements. And related to the claims impact, so project funds currently will be held until the completion of the monitoring process. And this is to ensure that funds are allocated to projects adhering to 2 CFR 200 and to maintain a quick monitoring process. So again, that's just the security mechanism that is authorized by Gopher, is authorized by 2 CFR 200, and that we just have to ensure that we're slowing down the funds disbursements, at least for the next few weeks, to make sure that we can go through this process, and again, to make sure that funds are being put into projects that are compliant with the federal requirements. As I mentioned, a majority of these requirements are stuff that was already provided as part of the application, or has been provided as part of your documentation updates throughout the process, or with status reports. So we're just going to go through the review process with the risk assessment, the monitoring process, and then once that's complete, then there shouldn't be an issue with claims moving forward. You can go to the next slide, please. So, as always, we do provide instructions on the Resource Hub for grant management system guidance and resources. If you've forgotten your user ID or forgotten your password, we have a system in place for updating that. Individual accounts per user, we have instructions on creating accounts. In theory, all the accounts for your project should already have been created, and if you needed to update them with us, feel free to do that. That just really applies to people who will be uploading documentation and uploading status reports and that kind of stuff. And if they're if you users can be associated with multiple organizations, so if you're using a grant administrator who's working with other projects as well, they can sign up and be aligned with the grant management system and with your project, so they can upload documentation on your behalf too. You can go to the next slide. So the next slide is key dates and deliverables. We've outlined sort of the timeline for the risk assessment process, the monitoring process here, and site visits as well. So the week of February 19th, we at CDFA will be completing the risk assessments. We'll outreach to schedule the first round of project site visits as well. The site visits will occur in sometime over March. We understand that this is a busy time of year. We're trying to currently batch them together by sort of geographic region to make things a little bit easier for everyone. So we will continue to provide updates related to the site visit process. The week of February 23rd, we'll have the risk assessments completed, and we'll be distributing the monitoring checklist to all projects and awardees. And those will need to be completed and returned by March 22nd. Of course, you are more than welcome to get them in as quickly as possible, as it does impact your ability to submit claims. So the sooner you get it done, the better. If you're anticipating any sort of issues with the monitoring process, feel free to reach out to us as early as possible, and we can certainly work with you on what will be needed and provide templates and kind of go through that. March 22nd, the monitoring checklist will be completed. All required documents will be uploaded into GMS. Again, you can do that before. And then April 15th is the next round of status reports that are due. So we are currently evaluating the first round of status reports for content, and report templates will be adjusted to increase clarity and align more closely with the monitoring process. So we might revise some of the questions that you might have seen in the first round of status reports. Our goal is to just try to make it as easy as possible for you as the projects to know what it is we're asking for, and to make it as easy as possible to provide that information, and to not have to duplicate efforts as much as possible, and just try to make sure that we're reporting to or that we're assisting you to report to CDFA standards, to Gopher standards, and to Treasury standards. And we're happy to answer any questions about key dates or deliverables as well.
So there is a question about just when the projects will hear about the frequency of their monitoring, but I think so that would be mid-February, I think, right after we've completed that.
Yeah, would you mind going back, Priscilla?
Yeah,
please.
The week of February 23rd.
Yeah, so that week, the risk assessments will be distributed and the monitoring checklist will be distributed. For example, for high risk projects that either don't have a substantial amount of this documentation already in place, or might need templates or support in locating those documents. The frequency that has been designated to us by the governor's office is every 30 days, but we'll be working with you, continually to make sure that we can get you into a place where the monitorings will be significantly less frequent and less continual. So again, once you get those documents in place, we don't really have to go back and revisit that. So the next, that process might be, might involve some back and forth, and it might be, require a little bit of time earlier on, but the more we're able to get that done at the beginning, the less we'll have to do later on over the course of the project.
Another question about claims.
Mm-hmm.
If claims will not be paid until monitoring is complete, how might organizations address a cash flow problem that would slow construction progress potentially?
Yeah, so I mean, if you're having, let's say you're working with a contractor or a vendor that is currently underway and is providing work, just being communicative with them and saying that, CDFA and the governor's office is requiring this process be completed. We anticipate having this process completed quickly. Again, you can have this done, in advance of the March 22nd deadline, especially if you have a lot of these documentations and documents in place. As I mentioned, as being a registered nonprofit or municipality, we should be able to move forward with the claims process relatively quickly. But again, if you do have any project specific questions, or if there are any issues that might be, that might create a substantial problem or grind things to a halt, please reach out to us directly, and we'll see what we can do to work with you on that. It just is, this is the process that's been outlined to us by the governor's office, so we have to follow it as closely as possible.
Okay, I think that's all the questions we have. If you have a question and you want to put it in the Q&A, we certainly still have plenty of time left to answer additional questions. But right now, that's all I'm seeing.
Is there anything in the chat, by chance? No, doesn't look like it. Great.
So if those are all the questions for now, we did record this, and we will share it out to everyone who's registered for this webinar, but certainly you're welcome to share it amongst others in your organization if that would be helpful. And please reach out to us. We are here to support you through this process and provide as much tech assistance as necessary to help assist you with all of the required monitoring. So thank you for joining us today, everyone, and I hope you have
We do have,
we
sorry, we do
oh,
have
I'm
one
sorry, is there
question
another one?
here. No, that's, yeah, one came in.
Oh, I'm
Are there
sorry.
differing compliance standards for grants versus forgivable loans? The primary difference is the procurement. So loans are not subject to the procurement requirements that the grants are subject to. We did provide explain who we reach out to and for what. Okay. Sorry, I'll continue with the compliance question, and then we can get to that. So we do differentiate between the grants and loans in the procurement section, but everything else will apply to both. So that's the environmental piece. That's all of the financial management documentation, the code of ethics, those kinds of things do apply. And we did provide and can resend out the loan grant hybrid compliance chart, which shows the 2 CFR 200 applicability between the grants and the loans, and and hopefully provide that information. And then if you do have any additional questions, we can talk with you offline as well. And can we explain who we reach out to for what? So for any contract related questions, you can reach out to Priscilla. For any compliance related questions related to the monitoring or the risk assessments, you can reach out to me, Chris Monroe. Justin Parker is our current program administrator, and I know a lot of you have been working with him as well, so he can be a point person. Pretty much you can reach out to any of us, and we can certainly bring questions back to the team. Questions about claims, you can reach out to me. And then I see a question here. Our project construction is 60% complete. How can we get the monitoring started ASAP? We'll be working through the risk assessment process relatively quickly. If you're already underway with your construction, it's because you've been compliant with everything else that we've requested. So in theory, the monitoring process should be relatively short, and then we can get online with that. But you can feel free to reach out to me, and we can sort of come up with a timeline individual for your project. I guess we can, I mean, that's it for
I didn't want to
questions.
jump.
If, no, that's okay. Yeah, I mean, I think if we maybe just want to stay on another couple minutes in case people are tapering off or have any additional questions that come up. I know we're relatively ahead of schedule. We, before everyone starts to hop off, or if we still have people on here, I just want to, take time and thank you for being on this webinar, for being part of the Community Center Investment Program, for working with us as we're building out this, our grant management system and our templates and our procedures relative to the guidance provided by the governor's office. And yeah, we're really excited about all your projects, and again, always happy to be here for you to answer any questions or work with you on any project specific questions. Cool.
Okay, I think we can. So thank you,
Yeah,
everyone. Appreciate your time. And please be in touch with us if you do have any additional questions related to this process.
you do have one in here. Can you explain the requirements for insurance equivalent to federal ownership? So that would be, and I'm sure someone will correct me if I'm wrong. We can provide additional guidance on this as well. Insurance equivalent to federal ownership means that you're protecting the asset or the equipment to at least its value, if that makes sense. So like if anything should happen to it, that it would be replaced in full, or it's basically a higher standard of insurance. But most projects, from what I've seen, align with that, but we can provide additional guidance related to that requirement as well, or reach out back to the governor's office for more information. And we'll see. There's any other questions? If not, feel free to hop off. I think we're good. I see people jumping off now. So, oh, another QA. Thanks, June. Yeah, we'll be in touch. I think we're good. I think we can end the meeting now. Let's do it. Count.